So I want you to picture something. Picture someone dancing, completely alone, after missing the last train home.
Oh, that is such a specific image.
Right. They're shivering, they're entirely stranded, but they're trying their absolute hardest to pretend they meant to stay out all along.
Yeah, just trying to play it cool.
Exactly. You have that exact intersection of, profound loneliness and absolute defiance. You just refuse to let the city know it has beaten you.
I love that.
And that incredibly specific, restless emotional space is the beating heart of the really fascinating 13-track album we are doing a deep dive into today. It's titled Coppercat on White Waters, 13 Puddles of the Silver Sea.
It is honestly a remarkable piece of work. And what we have in front of us today isn't just the audio, which is great. We actually have access to the complete lyrical sheets, the thematic direction, and a really detailed look into the behind-the-scenes creation process.
Yeah, the whole package.
Right, and the reason that mistrained imagery works so well to start us off is because, well, this album immediately drops you into a very distinct physical and psychological environment.
It really does. The environment isn't just a backdrop. It is practically the main character of the record. Because before a single word is even sung, you feel exactly where you are.
Absolutely.
And a massive part of that world building comes from the vocal identity. You hit play, and you are immediately struck by this rich, expressive alto voice, and she has this pronounced Northern English accent.
Yeah, that regional specificity does an immense amount of heavy lifting for the narrative. I mean, think about it. If you were to swap that voice out for like a polished mid-Atlantic indie pop vocal.
Oh, it would ruin it.
Entirely.
Yeah.
The entire emotional weight of the record would just collapse. The Northern accent acts as an anchor. It signals to the listener that these stories are rooted in a specific geography, like a lived, gritty reality.
Yeah, it feels real.
Exactly. And the delivery constantly shifts gears. She moves from these hushed, almost spoken word confessions right into soaring, aching choruses. You get the sense of a protagonist who is intelligent, highly vulnerable, but also carries this edge of volatility.
Volatility is the perfect word for it. It's like someone who might deliberately break your heart just to study the sound of it snapping.
Wow. Yes. That's exactly the vibe.
And the sonic landscape just wraps around that voice flawlessly. The arrangements, they begin in this incredibly sparse place. You are hearing the scrape of fingers on an acoustic guitar, some restrained bass.
Yeah, brush drums.
Right, brush drums, maybe an ambient piano texture here and there.
And instead of staying small, those arrangements gradually bloom into this cinematic, emotional crescendo. But crucially, they avoid the trap of becoming overproduced, which happens so often.
All the time.
Right. But here, the production preserves a really tangible sense of intimacy and imperfection. There is a live room warmth to it, a subtle tape saturation that makes the audio feel almost, tactile.
I noticed I was feeling this heavy, almost physical melancholy before she even got to the lyrics. And it made me wonder, how much of that is just standard acoustic reverb versus a deliberate psychological trick in the production?
It's definitely deliberate.
Because the atmosphere feels exactly like sitting in an empty pub after midnight or, standing on a wet street under sodium lights. The silence just feels heavy.
Yeah, that is entirely intentional. The producers treat reverb not just as an echo, but as what they call empty architecture.
Empty architecture. I like that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Reverb gives the brain spatial cues. So when you design a sound to bounce as if it's echoing off, say, damp brick and empty train station tiles, you are creating emotional weather.
Oh, wow. Emotional weather.
Right. It bypasses the logical part of your brain that analyzes chord progressions, and it puts your body directly into a state of isolation. The dampness of the instruments makes you feel the cold night air before the protagonist even starts singing about it.
That is so wild. So once you are shivering in that damp sonic architecture, the lyrics finally come in. And this is where the album pulls a really fascinating trick.
It really does.
We transition from this vast, echoing atmosphere into these incredibly grounded, microscopic human experiences. We start the journey in a pretty messy phase.
Very messy.
Yeah, emotional fragmentation, a toxic romantic fixation, and this deep urban alienation.
And the writing navigates this brilliant contradiction between sweeping poetic imagery and harsh conversational realism. It completely sidesteps the usual breakup cliches.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like a standard pop breakup album at all.
Not at all. It grounds every ounce of despair in tangible, everyday details. The protagonist isn't weeping in a void. She's navigating unpaid bills. She's watching cigarette smoke curl through the harsh light of a train platform.
Staring at paper cups of tea.
Exactly.
There was this one track early on, Neon in the Gutter, where she describes this toxic attraction as wait, let me get the quote right, a beautiful apparatus of systemic failure.
Oh, such a good line.
It is such a clinical, slightly detached way to articulate a relationship you know is actively destroying you. And then in the very same breath, she sings about dancing in oil and rainwater, and then mentions discussing the phenomenology of the kebab shop.
The phenomenology of the kebab shop, that juxtaposition of high academic language and late-night drunken fast food is just incredibly evocative.
It really is.
It captures that modern experience of being highly educated, entirely self-aware, and yet totally incapable of making healthy emotional choices.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Right. And this sense of total displacement is what makes her eventual movement so impactful. When you look at the lyrics describing her standing in Leeds, smelling damp wool, feeling like nothing more than a heavy bag and a wet coat waiting for a train.
It's so bleak.
It is. She is essentially a ghost haunting the public spaces of her own life. Track 4 is literally called Platform 4 Ghost.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate for a second regarding that lyrical style, though.
Sure, go for it.
I look at lines about damp wool or staring at sealed sugar packets in cheap hotels. Isn't focusing on those things a bit too, I don't know, mundane for a sweeping emotional ballad?
I can see why you'd ask that.
Because when I think of great songs of heartbreak, they usually tackle grand, sweeping concepts of love and loss, rather than, the smell of a wet sweater.
Well, taking a psychological view of how human memory actually processes trauma and heartbreak, the mundane is exactly where those feelings live.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, heartbreak rarely happens in a vacuum surrounded by a swelling orchestra. It happens while you are shivering at a bus stop. It hits you when you are staring at a completely insignificant object, like a paper cup or a sugar packet.
That's very true.
By anchoring overwhelming emotions, like the paralysis of a toxic relationship, to these highly tangible objects, the vulnerability bypasses our defenses. The mundane details act as a Trojan horse for the deeper emotional devastation.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. The sheer mundanity of the suffering makes it recognizable to you. And because we spend so much time trapped in that cycle of witty misery and bleak train stations, the shift that happens in the narrative feels completely earned. We start to track her evolution, moving away from romantic fixation and toward actual self-possession.
And the pacing of that evolution is critical. It doesn't just happen overnight. The narrative arc moves from self-sabotage to a very fragile independence.
Right.
We start to hear it in track 8, Streetlight Anatomy, where she stops simply drowning in her pain and starts observing it. She walks the long way home, looking for a pulse in the wet, black road, realizing that every orange streetlight overhead is like a heavy heart.
She's trying to figure out where she fits in between the curb and the dark. And that realization slowly builds into a literal and metaphorical climb in the next track, The Break in the Fog.
Yes.
You hear her describing the screes sliding under her boots, the wind shearing the salt from her skin. But she notes that the break in the fog is a promise.
A promise, yes.
And it builds to this massive emotional release on title shift, where she finally declares, I am a whole damn world without you in it. She starts pulling her anchors in.
I mean, taking off a heavy, soaking wet winter coat after you've been caught in a storm is a great way to put that transition, because what you hear in the production at that exact moment isn't triumphant horns or, like, an explosive pop victory.
No, not at all.
The dense layering just drops away. There's a sudden expansion of space. It doesn't mean the sun is instantly shining, but the crushing weight is gone.
You can finally breathe.
Exactly. And this highlights the album's emotional maturity. The protagonist doesn't win in a conventional sense. Her life isn't suddenly perfect. Instead, she arrives at a quiet resilience.
Yeah.
She achieves emotional independence simply by realizing she doesn't have to keep running. She stops feeding the toxic cycle.
Which brings us to the culmination of the entire album, embodied by its central recurring symbol, the copper cat.
Yes, the title symbol.
Throughout the record, the copper cat pops up as a motif. It's not just a literal animal. It functions as a really potent symbol of survival. It represents wandering, feminine resilience, pure instinct, and that primal search for shelter.
And the resolution of that imagery in the final coda is incredibly moving. The lyrics describe the cat's paws being heavy with red clay. She approaches a door where the screen is torn at the bottom corner.
Which is such a great detail.
It is. It's a specific, remembered place she used to scratch for a meal. And the narrator notes that the long performance is finally done. No more running from headlights. No more hiding under freight cars.
Quote, across the white waters she came back.
Exactly.
The copper cat becomes the ultimate metaphor for surviving this brutal psychological storm. It's not about conquering the world. It's about finally finding emotional refuge. Just a quiet, safe place to sleep under the kitchen chair.
It's beautiful.
It is. So we've just spent a significant amount of time marveling at this profound, lived-in, hyper-specific exploration of humanity. The damp wool, the northern accent, the cinematic melancholy.
We have. And this is where we have to reevaluate the entire landscape we just walked through.
Yeah.
Because the architecture of this album, the actual mechanism of its creation, it challenges our basic assumptions about authenticity.
Right, because Copper Cat on White Waters is actually a human-AI collaboration.
It is. And when you look at the tech stack and the creative process behind this record, it is a fascinating assembly of modern tools.
It really blew my mind when I read about it.
Right. The project was orchestrated by a human creator using a combination of Google Flow Music for the audio generation, Claude and ChatGPT as conversational partners for the lyrical and thematic development.
Wow.
Yeah. And they used Audacity for Alpha for the intricate audio slicing and tape saturation effects. And all of it was built on a Linux Ubuntu 26.04 system.
Okay, so my defenses immediately go up, and I know a lot of listeners will feel the exact same way.
Of course.
If an artificial intelligence generated the audio and assisted with the lyrics, whose loneliness are we actually feeling? Are we just projecting our own emotions onto a very clever algorithm?
It's a valid question.
Right. Does knowing a machine was involved rob the damp wool and those late-night train stations of their emotional authenticity?
That existential pushback is the most natural reaction in the world.
Yeah.
But to understand what is actually happening here, we need to look at the concept of aleatory art.
Aleatory art.
Yes, which is essentially art that incorporates elements of chance or randomness. The human creator didn't just push a button and ask a machine to spit out a masterpiece about a breakup.
Yeah.
They used AI as a collaborative instrument.
So it's like working with an unpredictable, highly chaotic studio musician who occasionally plays something brilliant by accident.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. Imagine working with an improvising jazz band. You, as the composer, provide the framework, the tempo, and the emotional direction.
Right.
The bassist might suddenly play a sour note, or the drummer might drag the beat in a way you never would have written yourself. But that accident creates an emotional juxtaposition that makes the whole progression sound incredible. The AI introduces pathways of nonlinear inspiration.
So, mechanically speaking, how does that actually work with this specific tech stack?
Well, the human acts as the curator and the emotional architect. They might write a detailed prompt for Claude, detailing their own lived memory of standing in Leeds in the freezing rain, smelling damp wool, and feeling like a ghost.
Oh, I see.
The AI generates pages of lyrical imagery based on that feeling. Most of it might be unusable, but buried in there is the phrase phenomenology of the kebab shop.
And the human spots it.
Exactly. The human recognizes the brilliance of that juxtaposition because they have actually lived that contradiction, so they extract it.
And then they take those curated lyrics and that specific emotional vibe, and they feed it into Google Flow Music to start generating the acoustic stems and the vocal performances.
Precisely. They prompt the system for a Northern English alto voice. They prompt it for empty architecture reverb and sparse finger-picked guitar. Flow Music generates multiple iterations.
Right, lots of takes.
The human listens, discards the ones that feel emotionally hollow, and selects the moments of accidental beauty. Then, they take those audio stems into Audacity on their Linux machine, cut them up, arrange the pacing, add the analog tape saturation, and sequence the 13 tracks to build that specific narrative arc from alienation to resilience.
I see. So the intentionality, the sequencing, the editing, and the final aesthetic judgment all originate from the human mind.
Exactly.
The machine hallucinates 1,000 different variations of a rainy night, but the human is the one who says, yes, that specific snare brush and that specific vocal crack on the word ghost is exactly what my heartbreak felt like.
You nailed it. The AI is entirely devoid of emotion, but it possesses a massive vocabulary of sound and language. The human brings the lived experience.
Right.
If we look at the broader history of art, almost every new piece of technology, whether it was multi-track recording, the synthesizer, or the electric guitar, was initially met with suspicion.
People always push back at first.
Always. Critics argued it wasn't real music because a machine was generating the tone. But those tools simply allowed musicians to articulate entirely new textures of feeling. In this case, AI acted as a catalyst to help the human author unearth their most specific, vivid, emotional truths.
You know, that reframing actually makes the accomplishment even more impressive to me. Because the human had to possess the emotional intelligence to recognize the beauty in what the AI was reflecting back at them.
Yes.
They had to know what it actually feels like to be a ghost on Platform 4, to know that the generated song captured the isolation perfectly.
The machine didn't write the story of the copper cat. The human found the copper cat in the static and carved it out. It is an expansion of human imagination rather than a surrender of authorship.
When you look back at the album through that lens, it completely reevaluates the relationship we have with our own memories. Knowing that a human used these advanced algorithms to meticulously recreate the exact dampness of a train station platform or the exact crushing weight of a toxic relationship, it just proves how desperate we are to be understood.
It really does.
We will use the most advanced technology on Earth just to accurately communicate the feeling of waiting for a bus in the rain.
And that is ultimately the true power of Copper Cat on White Waters. It functions much less like a standard breakup album and much more like a profound meditation on identity, survival, and the grueling journey to find a quiet sense of belonging in a world that often feels overwhelmingly disconnected.
It really makes you think about how you weather your own emotional storms. When you find yourself in those moments of urban alienation, feeling entirely disconnected from the world moving around you, how do you stop running? How do you find your own break in the fog?
It is a question we all have to answer eventually, whether we are navigating it alone or trying to build a shelter out of the wreckage.
It really is a masterpiece of emotional weather. But I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to mull over today. We started by picturing someone dancing alone after missing the last train, wrapped in this profound, distinctly human loneliness. We often talk about how screens and algorithms and artificial intelligence are isolating us, building walls between human connection. But if a collaboration between a human mind and a machine can so perfectly articulate the painfully human feeling of being stranded in the rain,
Right.
maybe technology isn't alienating us from our emotions after all.
Maybe.
Just maybe it's providing us with a brand new vocabulary to finally understand them.